Bullets are flying, men are screaming, and in the middle of all that fire and blood and chaos, a horse refuses to run. Not because it can't, not because it's trapped, because it won't leave its soldier behind. This is not a story you've heard before, and by the end of it, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, courage, and what it really means to be a hero on the battlefield. Stay with me, because what this horse did in the final moments of the war, nobody saw coming, not even the soldiers who were there. The year is 1916. The Western Front, France, mud, barbed wire, the smell of gunpowder so thick you can taste it on your tongue. Thousands of men buried in trenches that stretch for miles in both directions, sleeping in filth, eating cold rations, watching their friends disappear into the smoke one by one. This is the reality of World War I, not the version from textbooks, the real version, where boys become old men in a week, where the ground shakes so hard it feels like the earth itself is trying to swallow you whole. And somewhere in the middle of all this, there is a horse named Warrior, a bay thoroughbred, lean, powerful, dark as midnight, with a white blaze running down his face. He arrived at the front with General Jack Seeley, the man who had raised him from a foal on the Isle of Wight. They had grown up together, trained together, and now they had come to war together. But here is the thing about Warrior that nobody expected. He was not afraid. While other horses panicked at the sound of artillery rearing up, thrashing against their restraints, collapsing from shell shock, Warrior stood still. His ears would flatten, his nostrils would flare, and then he would move forward into the fire, into the smoke, into the noise that turned grown men into trembling children. The soldiers who served with General Seeley noticed it immediately. "That horse is different," one young lieutenant told his commanding officer. "The guns go off and he doesn't even flinch. It's like he knows something we don't." And maybe he did, because what Warrior was about to face over the next few years would test every living creature to its absolute limit, and what he did when the worst moment finally arrived would cement his name in history forever. But first you need to understand what the Western Front actually was. Imagine a scar running across the face of an entire continent, 400 miles long, a wound that wouldn't heal. On one side, the Allied forces, British, French, Canadian, Australian. On the other, the German Imperial Army, and between them, no man's land. A stretch of earth so torn apart by artillery shells that it looked like the surface of the moon, craters filled with water, tangles of rusted wire, the remains of men who hadn't been recovered. It was not just a battlefield, it was the end of the world as they knew it. Into this nightmare, the British cavalry rode their horses. By 1916, most military commanders had already begun to understand that cavalry charges were largely obsolete in modern warfare. Machine guns made mounted charges suicidal, and yet horses remained absolutely essential. They carried supplies, they carried wounded men, they carried messages when radio communication failed, they carried the weight of the entire war effort on their backs, literally and figuratively. Over 8 million horses died in World War I. 8 million. Let that number sit for a moment. Most of them died not from bullets or shells, but from exhaustion, disease, starvation, and the cold. They died pulling artillery pieces through mud so deep it swallowed them whole. They died standing in waterlogged fields, their legs rotting from a condition soldiers called mud fever. They died quiet, unnoticed deaths while the humans around them wrote letters home and received medals. Warrior should have died a dozen times over. The first time was at the Battle of the Somme, July 1916, one of the bloodiest single days in military history. 60,000 British casualties in a single day. The artillery barrage that preceded the attack had been so enormous, so relentless, that British commanders genuinely believed the German lines would simply collapse. They didn't. And when the whistle blew and the men went over the top, they walked into a wall of machine gun fire. General Seeley was forward with his cavalry unit, waiting for the breakthrough that never came. Artillery shells were landing all around them. One landed close enough to knock Seeley from his saddle. When he recovered and looked up, expecting to find Warrior thrown to the ground in panic, the horse was standing over him, not running, not rearing, standing there, head lowered, body trembling, but feet planted, shielding his rider from the secondary blast. "He came back to me," Seeley wrote later in his memoirs. "I don't know how to explain it other than he came back." The soldiers who saw it went silent. War animal. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me, do you think animals can truly feel loyalty the way humans do? Because what I'm about to tell you next is going to make that question a lot more complicated. The months roll forward. Autumn, then winter. The trenches fill with water. Horses begin dying by the hundreds. Mud, fever tears through the cavalry lines. Animals that had crossed entire oceans to reach this battlefield simply lie down in the mud and don't get up again. The veterinary units are overwhelmed. There aren't enough men, enough medicine, enough dry ground, and still Warrior survives. The soldiers start to notice something else about him now. It's not just that he doesn't panic panic under fire. It's that other horses calm down when he's near. Geldings that have been trembling for 3 days straight stop shaking when Warrior is walked past their lines. A young horse who had been so traumatized by a nearby shell blast that he'd stopped eating entirely the moment Warrior was stabled next to him, he started eating again. He's like medicine, one of the grooms said. I don't know what it is, but the other horses feel it too. The men started calling him the horse the Germans couldn't kill. It started as dark humor, the way soldiers always use dark humor to cope with impossible situations. But as the months passed and the shells kept falling and the casualty lists kept growing, it became something else. It became a kind of faith, a superstition wrapped around a living, breathing animal. If Warrior was still alive, maybe they would be too. That belief was about to be tested beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Spring 1918. The situation has become catastrophic. Germany launches Operation Michael, the largest offensive on the Western Front since the war began. Over 60 German divisions punched through the Allied lines in a matter of hours. The British Fifth Army essentially disintegrates. Men are retreating in chaos. Positions that had been held for years are abandoned in hours. The entire Allied line is in danger of collapsing. It is, by every military assessment, the closest the Allies came to losing the First World War. And in the middle of this unfolding disaster, General Seeley receives orders that will put Warrior directly in the path of the German advance. The Canadian Cavalry Brigade, 3 regiments, horses, sabers, moving forward while everyone else is moving back. Seeley looks at Warrior. The horse looks back at him, dark eyes steady, ears forward. "All right," Seeley says quietly, "one more time." What happened next at Moreuil Wood on March 30th, 1918 is one of the most extraordinary military engagements of the entire war, and it almost never gets talked about. The wood sits on a ridge overlooking the Avray River. If the Germans take it, they have a direct line of advance toward Amiens, and Amiens was the critical railway junction connecting the British and French armies. If Amiens falls, the Allied forces split. And if the Allied forces split, the war is over. Germany wins. Seeley rides Warrior to the edge of the field, 300 yards of open ground between them and the tree line, German machine guns, German rifles, German soldiers who have been advancing for 4 days straight and are not going to stop now. He turns in the saddle and looks at the men behind him. Young men, most of them barely 20 years old, sitting on horses that are trembling. Some of the men are trembling too, though they'd never admit it. "We go in," Seeley says. "Full gallop. Don't stop." There is a moment, just a moment of absolute silence, and then Warrior lunges forward, not because Seeley spurred him hard, not because he had no choice. He lunged forward the way he always did, the way he had always done, every single time. The noise and the smoke and the fear told every other living creature to run the other direction. He chose forward. The other horses followed. 300 yards of open ground at full gallop, machine gun fire cutting through the air like a saw blade, men falling, horses screaming and going down. Dirt and snow and blood spraying up around the hooves of the riders, still charging. Warrior doesn't stop. He takes a bullet graze across his flank. The wound will need stitching later. The scar will stay with him for life, and he doesn't break stride. The Canadian cavalry hits the German line at the wood's edge like a hammer. The fighting inside Moreuil Wood is brutal. Close quarters. Cavalry against infantry in the trees. It lasts hours. The Canadians take enormous casualties, but they hold the wood. They push the Germans back. They buy enough time for Allied reinforcements to arrive and stabilize the line. Amiens does not fall. The Allied forces do not split. The war does not end that day. Some historians argue that the charge at Moreuil Wood was one of the decisive moments of the entire First World War. Not a guarantee of victory, but a prevention of defeat at the worst possible moment. A hinge point. And at the center of that charge, leading it, carrying his rider through machine gun fire across 300 yards of open ground, was Warrior. When the battle was over and the men counted their dead and the horses were checked for wounds, one of the young troopers walked over to where Warrior stood, sides heaving, the wound on his flank still bleeding slowly. The soldier put his hand on the horse's neck. Warrior turned his head and looked at him. "I followed him in," the soldier said later, to a journalist who came to write the story. "I know that sounds strange, but I looked at that horse going forward and I thought, if he can do it, I can do it. That horse saved my life. Not by carrying me out of there, by going in first." War animal, this is what I want you to think about. Not just what Warrior did, but what he represented to those men. In a war that had stripped away every illusion, every romantic idea about glory and heroism and noble sacrifice, this horse kept showing up, kept going forward, kept choosing the same direction as the men who were terrified. What does it say about courage when a horse has more of it than the whole world expected? Warrior survived the war. He came home to the Isle of Wight with General Seeley in 1918. He lived, and this is the part that genuinely genuinely stops people. He lived until 1941, 25 years after the charge at Moreuil Wood. He outlived the war. He outlived the peace. He was still alive when the next World War began. Seeley visited him every day until the end. When Warrior finally died, Seeley was devastated in a way that people around him said they had never seen before. This was a man who had commanded cavalry brigades in 2 wars, who had been shot at and bombed and blown from his saddle, and losing this horse broke something open in him that nothing else had. He had already written a book about Warrior, published in 1934. The dedication reads simply, "To Warrior, the horse the Germans couldn't kill." The book sold tens of thousands of copies. Soldiers who had served on the Western Front wrote letters to Seeley from all over the world after reading it, telling him they remembered the horse, telling him what Warrior had meant to them. One veteran wrote, "I never thought I would cry reading about a horse, but then I suppose he wasn't just a horse to us. He was proof that something could survive all of it. Something could survive all of it." In 2014, nearly 100 years after the Battle of Moreuil Wood, the Brook Animal Welfare Charity awarded Warrior a posthumous PDSA Dickin Medal. The Dickin Medal is the highest military honor an animal can receive. It's sometimes called the Animal Victoria Cross. The citation reads that Warrior received the award for his extraordinary service to the Allied forces during the First World War, embodying the courage and loyalty of the millions of horses who served. Millions of horses. 8 million died. Warrior lived. And in living, he carried the memory of all of them forward. There's a bronze statue of Warrior now standing on the Isle of Wight, not far from where he was born. Soldiers visit it, children visit it. People who have never had any connection to the First World War stand in front of it and feel something they can't quite name. Maybe it's grief for all the animals who didn't make it home. Maybe it's something closer to awe, the specific kind of awe you feel when a living creature does something that reveals the limits of what you thought was possible. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just gratitude for a horse that went forward when everything in the world said stop, for a horse that stood over a fallen rider when the shells were still coming down, for a horse that led a charge at Moreuil Wood when the fate of an entire war hung in the balance, for a horse that refused to leave the battlefield. If Warrior's story moved you, if it reminded you that loyalty and courage aren't exclusively human qualities, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want to know about the dog who ran into no man's land every single night for 3 years and always came back, that story is waiting for you next. And I promise you, what that dog did in the final week of the war will leave you completely speechless.